He was declared dead on a gray afternoon when the paperwork was finally signed. The kind of day that leaves no strong memory behind, except the dull weight of inevitability. The decision did not come after a dramatic discovery or a shocking revelation, but rather at the end of a long, bureaucratic silence. Years in which no one had seen him, no one had heard his voice, and no official trace of him remained. To the system, that silence meant absence, and absence eventually meant death. The man had vanished quietly, without witnesses, without blood, without any clear explanation, and over time the world learned to move forward without him, folding his name into old records and forgotten conversations. His family had already grieved in slow motion, adjusting to a loss that never had a body, only questions, and when the final declaration came, it felt less like an ending and more like an exhausted acceptance of something that had already happened. Death, in this case, was not a moment, but a conclusion drawn from emptiness. The disappearance itself had not seemed especially unusual at first. Adults disappear all the time, especially men who live solitary lives, who drift between temporary jobs and rented rooms, who leave no deep imprint on any single place. He had been one of those men, quiet, observant, present but rarely noticed. He paid his rent late, but paid it eventually. He showed up to work until one day he didn't. His phone rang unanswered, then stopped ringing altogether. Letters were returned, unopened. The landlord assumed he had moved on. His employer replaced him after a week. No one called the police right away, because no one felt certain that something was wrong. This was the dangerous space where disappearance thrives, that narrow zone between concern and indifference, where time slips by without action. When the police were finally contacted, months had passed. The apartment had already been cleared and rented again, his belongings reduced to a few unclaimed items in storage. There were no signs of violence, no financial anomalies dramatic enough to raise alarms, no recent conflicts that could suggest foul play. His bank account showed small withdrawals over a short period, then nothing. His passport had not been used. There were no border records, no hospital admissions, no arrests. It was as if he had stepped sideways out of the visible world. Investigators followed routine procedures, checked databases, interviewed the few people who knew him, and reached the same conclusion again and again. There was nothing solid to follow. Years passed, and the case grew colder, not because it was unsolved in a dramatic sense, but because it slowly dissolved into administrative dust. Files were archived. Leads were closed with neutral language. Eventually, the legal process caught up with reality as it appeared to be. After a required waiting period, after repeated confirmations that no new information had surfaced, the court declared him dead. His name was entered into registries that list the deceased, his identity officially transformed from a living uncertainty into a settled fact. His family received documents rather than answers, certificates instead of explanations. And though the pain remained unresolved, it was at least given a shape that allowed them to move forward. For years after that, nothing disturbed the stillness of his absence. The world continued, as it always does, indifferent to the gaps left by individuals who vanish without spectacle. His name might have appeared briefly in genealogical searches or insurance records, but otherwise it lay dormant, a closed chapter. It was assumed that whatever had happened to him had ended badly, perhaps suddenly, perhaps alone, in a way that left no trace. This assumption, though unsupported by evidence, was emotionally convenient because it aligned with the finality people expect from loss. The idea that he might still be alive was too unsettling, too unresolved, and over time it became easier to believe in his death than to imagine his continued existence somewhere unknown. The moment when this certainty began to fracture did not arrive with a dramatic announcement. It began with a clerical inconsistency, a minor error that should not have existed. A routine audit in a distant office flagged a discrepancy involving an identification number that belonged to a man who, according to official records, no longer existed. The system treated this as a malfunction, a data glitch, something to be corrected rather than questioned. But when the discrepancy persisted, when it connected to a real physical interaction rather than a digital anomaly, someone paused long enough to look closer. A form had been signed, a service had been used, a face had been seen. At first, the possibility was dismissed. Systems make mistakes, people misunderstand records, names overlap. But this was not a shared name or a similar birth date. This was a precise match, down to details that should have been locked permanently in the past. The deeper the inquiry went, the more uncomfortable it became, because every step challenged the assumption that the records were correct. If the man was alive, then his death had been a legal fiction, a conclusion reached not by evidence, but by absence. And absence, it turned out, could lie. The investigation reopened quietly, cautiously, because no one wanted to announce a resurrection before confirming it. Officials retraced steps that had been considered complete, reviewing archived documents with fresh eyes. They found no fraud in the original declaration, no procedural error, only the limits of what could be known at the time. The system had done what it was designed to do, but the design itself had a flaw. It assumed that people do not disappear completely unless they are no longer alive. What it did not account for was deliberate erasure, the possibility that someone might choose to step outside every structure that makes them legible to society. When confirmation finally came, it arrived in the most ordinary way imaginable. A man stood in a line, presented identification, and answered questions. He did not attempt to hide. He did not resist. He simply existed, unaware that his existence was impossible according to law. When officials compared his face to old photographs, the resemblance was undeniable, aged but unmistakable. Fingerprints matched. Records aligned. The man officially declared dead was standing in front of them, alive, breathing, confused by the attention but real in every sense that mattered. The revelation sent a quiet shock through the systems that had once closed his file. There was no celebration, no dramatic confrontation, only a slow realization that something assumed to be finished was not finished at all. The man was alive, but the life he had lived in the intervening years was largely invisible, stripped of the markers that would have connected him to his former identity. He had survived not by existing within society, but by skirting its edges, avoiding documentation, minimizing interaction, becoming, in effect, a ghost among the living. His story, when it began to emerge, was not one of sudden tragedy or criminal intent, but of gradual withdrawal. He had not planned his disappearance with precision. There was no moment where he decided to erase himself completely. Instead, it happened incrementally, driven by exhaustion, fear, and a desire to escape a life that felt increasingly unmanageable. He stopped answering calls. He stopped opening mail. He left without telling anyone because telling someone would have made it real. By the time he realized how far he had gone, returning felt more complicated than continuing forward into anonymity. The years he spent officially dead were not easy. Without valid identification, access to stable work, housing, and health care was limited. He relied on informal arrangements, cash payments, transient spaces. He learned how to exist with minimal footprint, how to avoid questions that would require documentation. He was alive, but only barely visible, sustained by a careful balance of compliance and withdrawal. This existence, while harsh, offered something he had not felt before: relief from expectations, from the pressure of being known, From the weight of a name tied to obligations he no longer felt capable of meeting. When confronted with the reality of his legal death, his reaction was not shock, but a quiet resignation. In some sense, he had already accepted that version of events long before the paperwork was signed. To him, the declaration merely formalized what he had been living, a life outside recognition. What he had not anticipated was the difficulty of returning. Resurrection, it turned out, was more complex than disappearance. Restoring an identity required navigating systems that were not designed to reverse themselves easily. The law could declare someone dead with relative efficiency, but declaring them alive again was an entirely different process. The aftermath unfolded slowly, marked by administrative confusion and emotional dissonance. His family was informed cautiously, unsure how to process news that contradicted years of grief. Reunions were tentative, strained by time, by unanswered questions, by the simple fact that he had chosen absence over explanation. Forgiveness was not immediate. Trust was not automatic. The man they had mourned was alive, but not unchanged, and the relationship they had imagined resuming no longer existed in the same form. From a legal perspective, his return raised questions that extended beyond his individual case. If a man could be declared dead while alive, what did that say about the reliability of the systems that manage identity? How many others existed in similar states of erasure, not officially deceased, but effectively untraceable? The case did not prompt sweeping reform, but it lingered in professional circles as a reminder of the limits of certainty. Death, it suggested, could sometimes be a conclusion drawn from ignorance rather than fact. The man himself did not seek attention. He did not tell his story publicly. For him, the experience was not a mystery to be solved, but a period of survival to be endured. Being alive again, officially, meant re-entering a world that had continued without him, a world that expected explanations he did not have the words to give. His story, when told, lacked the drama people expected. There were no kidnappers, no hidden fortunes, no secret lives of intrigue. There was only a man who had stepped away and discovered that stepping back was harder than stepping out. In the end, his case was less about death than about absence, about how easily a person can slip through the cracks when visibility is mistaken for existence. He had not died, but the world had learned to function as if he had, and that assumption had shaped years of decisions, emotions, and records. His return did not undo that history. It merely complicated it, adding a layer of ambiguity to a story that had once seemed closed. And in that ambiguity lay a quiet truth, that being alive is not always the same as being seen, and that sometimes the line between the two can disappear entirely. The story does not resolve neatly, because life rarely does. There was no moment where everything snapped back into place, no clear moral to be drawn. Instead, there was a gradual adjustment, a slow recalibration of identity, relationships, and expectations. The man continued living, now officially alive, but still carrying the imprint of years spent outside recognition. His case faded from attention as new anomalies took its place, but for those who encountered it, the lesson remained. That death, when defined by paperwork rather than proof, can sometimes be an error of assumption rather than an end. The years he spent outside official existence were not dramatic in the way people imagine disappearances. There were no hidden identities crafted with care, no elaborate plans to become someone else. Instead, his life narrowed slowly, shrinking down to the essentials required to remain physically alive. He learned which questions not to answer, which conversations to avoid, how to appear unremarkable enough that no one would look twice. He avoided places that required paperwork, avoided situations that demanded explanation. His name, once a routine part of daily interactions, became something he no longer used unless absolutely necessary, and even then only in fragments, spoken quietly, without confidence. He moved often, not because he was chased, but because staying too long in one place created familiarity, and familiarity invited questions. Short-term work, paid in cash, became his primary means of survival. Construction sites, cleanup crews, seasonal labor, where turnover was constant and record-keeping minimal. He slept in rooms that were not truly his, spaces that held no permanence, places where he could leave without leaving anything behind. Every object he owned had to be portable, every possession replaceable. Over time, he stopped accumulating altogether, living in a state where loss was no longer something to fear because there was nothing left to lose. The absence of identity carried a peculiar psychological weight. Without documents, without official acknowledgement, he existed in a liminal state, present but unrecognized. He could not plan long-term, could not imagine a future beyond the next few weeks. Relationships were shallow by necessity, because deeper connections required honesty, and honesty required a past he could not explain. He learned to listen more than speak, to deflect curiosity with vagueness, to become forgettable by design. This invisibility was both a shield and a prison, protecting him from scrutiny while trapping him in isolation. There were moments when he considered returning, moments when the strain of constant caution felt heavier than whatever consequences awaited him. These moments often came late at night, when exhaustion loosened the discipline he maintained during the day. He imagined walking into an office, stating his name, reclaiming his place in the world. But each time, the imagined scene collapsed under its own complexity. What would he say about the years he had lost? How would he explain his absence without revealing the fear and paralysis that had driven it? The longer he stayed away, the harder return became, not because of external barriers, but because of the accumulated weight of silence. When he learned, indirectly, that he had been declared dead, the information reached him in a fragmented way, passed through casual conversation rather than official notification. Someone mentioned a name, a coincidence, a story about a man who vanished and was presumed gone. At first, he dismissed it as unrelated, but as details emerged, recognition set in slowly. His own name, his own birth date, spoken as part of a narrative that no longer included him as a living participant. The realization was unsettling, not because it frightened him, but because it confirmed something he had already felt, that the world had moved on decisively in his absence. Being legally dead changed little about his daily life. He continued working where he could, sleeping where he was allowed, existing in the same margins he had occupied before. But internally, the knowledge altered his perception of self. There was a strange clarity in knowing that, on paper, he no longer existed. The expectations that once weighed on him felt definitively severed. There were no responsibilities tied to his name anymore, no obligations waiting to be fulfilled. He was free in a way that few people ever are, unanchored from identity, history, and future all at once. This freedom, however, came at a cost that became more apparent with time. Aging without identity was a slow erosion. Health issues could not be addressed easily. Injuries were endured rather than treated. He became acutely aware of his physical vulnerability, of how dependent survival is on systems that require recognition. Each year that passed narrowed his options further, and though he remained alive, the quality of that life diminished in subtle but cumulative ways. The invisibility that once felt protective began to feel like a slow suffocation. The moment when his status was discovered did not unfold dramatically for him. There was no sudden confrontation, No arrest, no accusation. Instead, it was marked by confusion, by a series of questions that did not immediately make sense. He was asked to verify details that he had long stopped thinking about, details tied to a life that felt distant and unreal. As officials compared records, as they realized the contradiction between his physical presence and his legal status, the atmosphere shifted from routine to cautious disbelief. He watched this process with a detached curiosity, as if observing a story that belonged to someone else. Being told explicitly that he was officially dead was not shocking. It was almost reassuring, a confirmation of what he had already internalized. What surprised him was the reaction of others, the way the information unsettled systems designed to categorize and resolve, not to confront ambiguity. His existence represented a flaw, a case that did not fit cleanly into established procedures. He was not a criminal, not a victim, not a fraudster. He was simply someone who had stepped away long enough for the system to give up on finding him. As the process of reinstating his legal identity began, he encountered a different kind of complexity. Documents had to be corrected, records amended, declarations reversed. Each step required proof, testimony, validation from systems that had once erased him by default. The irony was not lost on him. To prove he was alive, he had to navigate processes more demanding than those that had declared him dead. Life, it seemed, required more evidence than death. Reconnecting with his family was the most emotionally charged aspect of his return. The initial contact was cautious, mediated through official channels, softened by preparation. When they finally spoke, words felt inadequate. Years of absence could not be compressed into explanations, and apologies felt insufficient to address the depth of hurt his disappearance had caused. His family had grieved him without closure, had learned to live with uncertainty, and had eventually accepted a form of loss that now felt disrupted rather than resolved. His return reopened wounds that had begun to scar over, forcing them to renegotiate emotions they thought they had finished processing. Trust, once broken by silence, proved difficult to rebuild. Questions lingered without satisfying answers. Why had he not reached out? Why had he chosen absence over communication? He struggled to articulate the internal collapse that had driven his disappearance, the paralysis that had made even small actions feel impossible. From the outside, his absence appeared deliberate, even selfish. From the inside, it had felt like the only way to survive a life that had become overwhelming beyond explanation. Publicly, his case attracted limited attention, framed as an anomaly rather than a mystery. There was no scandal, no dramatic revelation that demanded sustained interest. It was treated as a bureaucratic curiosity, a reminder that systems sometimes fail quietly rather than catastrophically. Professionals discussed it in terms of procedure and safeguards, debating how such cases could be prevented in the future. But for the man at the center of it, the experience was deeply personal, marked not by procedural failure, but by human vulnerability. He did not seek to reclaim what he had lost. There was no attempt to return to his former career, no effort to resume relationships exactly as they had been. Instead, he approached life with a cautious humility, aware of how fragile identity could be, how easily it could slip away. He accepted help reluctantly, uncomfortable with dependency after years of enforced self-reliance. Each interaction carried a residue of mistrust, not toward others, but toward the stability of the world itself. The psychological impact of being declared dead lingered long after his legal status was corrected. There were moments when he felt disconnected from his own existence, as if he were observing himself from a distance. The idea that he had been mourned, that people had cried over his absence, while he continued living unnoticed, created a dissonance that was difficult to reconcile. He carried a quiet guilt, not because he had intended harm, but because harm had occurred nonetheless. In reflecting on his experience, he did not frame it as an escape or an adventure. There was no romanticism in his account, no suggestion that disappearance offered clarity or freedom. Instead, he described it as a narrowing, a gradual constriction of options until survival became the only objective. The world he had stepped out of was not replaced by something better. It was replaced by a void that required constant vigilance to navigate. If anything, his story served as a caution against the idea that one can simply leave without consequence. The systems that had once failed to locate him now worked diligently to reintegrate him, but the process was imperfect. Some records remained inconsistent. Some traces of his legal death persisted in databases not designed for reversal. These inconsistencies followed him like shadows, reminders that erasure, once enacted, is never fully undone. Even as he moved forward, fragments of his non-existence lingered, surfacing unexpectedly in mundane situations, forcing him to confront the reality of his past absence again and again. His case prompted discussions about the nature of proof and existence. If a person can live for years without official recognition, what defines being alive in the eyes of society? Is it breath and heartbeat, or documentation and traceability? The answers varied depending on perspective, but the question itself remained unresolved. His experience highlighted a gap between biological life and social existence, a space where people can exist without being accounted for, alive yet functionally erased. As time passed, his story faded into obscurity, replaced by new cases, new anomalies. He became, once again, an ordinary man, though shaped by extraordinary circumstances. The attention dissipated, the questions subsided, and life settled into a cautious normalcy. Yet the knowledge of his former legal death remained with him, a quiet awareness that existence is not as absolute as it seems, that recognition can be withdrawn as easily as it is granted. In the end, his story did not conclude with resolution or redemption. There was no triumphant return, no clear moral lesson. Instead, it offered a subtle reminder of the fragility of systems that claim certainty, of the ease with which absence can be mistaken for finality. He had not returned from death because he had never truly died, but the world had learned to accept his absence as if he had. And in that acceptance lay the unsettling truth that sometimes the boundary between life and death is not marked by events, but by attention. The man continued living, carrying the weight of years spent unseen, navigating a world that had once erased him without malice or intent. His existence now registered properly in systems and records, but the experience had altered his perception permanently. He understood, perhaps more deeply than most, that being alive is not merely a biological state, but a condition maintained by recognition, by connection, by participation in structures that validate presence. Without those, life continues, but in a diminished, precarious form. Looking back, he did not wish for the years he had lost, nor did he attempt to reconstruct them. They belonged to a version of himself shaped by fear and withdrawal, a version he acknowledged without romanticizing. What mattered was not reclaiming the past, but understanding the mechanisms that had allowed him to disappear so completely. His story, though rare, revealed vulnerabilities inherent in systems built on assumptions rather than certainty. For those who encounter his case, the lingering question is not how he survived, but how easily he vanished in the first place. The answer lies not in conspiracy or neglect, but in the ordinary functioning of systems that rely on visibility to confirm existence. When visibility fades, so does recognition, and eventually, so does the assumption of life. His return disrupted that assumption, forcing a reconsideration of what it means to be present in a world governed by records rather than relationships. The story ends not with closure, but with continuity. The man lives on, quietly, deliberately, aware of the thin line that once separated him from being officially gone. His experience serves as a quiet testament to the fact that life can persist in the absence of acknowledgement, but that acknowledgement remains essential for living fully. In a world that measures existence through documentation, his story stands as a reminder that absence is not always evidence of death, and that sometimes the most profound disappearances occur without a trace, leaving behind not a mystery, but a gap filled by assumption.